When I first saw the house, I thought it was perfect. The faded paint, the uneven shutters, it had character. It felt like the kind of place you could start over in. That's what I needed, a fresh start, away from the chaos I'd left behind in the city. Salem was quiet, calm. It promised simplicity. As I stood there in front of that old Victorian, I convinced myself that this was where everything would finally fall into place. Inside, the floors creaked under every step, but there was a certain charm to it. The way the wood groaned beneath my weight, like it had stories to tell if I'd only listen. The house felt alive, but in a way that was comforting at first. Even the musty smell of age, mixed with the faint scent of dust and forgotten memories, felt right somehow. It was peaceful, or so I thought. It didn't take long for the oddities to begin. Little things at first. Keys I was sure I'd left on the table appearing on the counter, the faint clink of something moving in another room when I knew I was alone. I brushed it off. New place, old house. My mind was probably just playing tricks on me, right? I'd laugh at myself, telling myself to relax, to stop being paranoid. But that feeling of being watched, it clung to me like a shadow just at the edge of my awareness. The nights were the worst. I'd lie there, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing with all the reasons I shouldn't be so damn jumpy. But no matter how many times I told myself it was nothing, that creeping unease wouldn't leave. I could feel the weight of the darkness pressing in around me, the silence almost too heavy. And then there was the noise. At first, I thought it was the wind, a faint hum, maybe a breeze slipping through the cracks. But it wasn't. It felt intentional, like something just out of reach, whispering, too soft to make out. It wasn't until the third week that I stopped ignoring it. That night, I woke up with a start, heart racing. The room felt colder than usual, the air thick like it didn't belong. I lay still, my breath barely audible, listening. Something was off. I strained to hear, my pulse pounding in my ears, and that's when I noticed it. My bedroom door. It had been open when I went to bed. Now it was almost closed, a sliver of shadow cutting through the hallway light. I hadn't touched it. I hadn't even gotten up. I sat up, every muscle tense, waiting for something, anything, to explain what I was feeling. But there was only silence. And that door, barely open, like it was watching me, waiting. A ridiculous thought, but one that wouldn't leave me alone. I finally stood, feet hitting the cold floor harder than I intended, and made my way to the door. My hand hesitated on the knob, as if some part of me knew there was something on the other side I didn't want to face. But I opened it anyway. The hallway was empty. The hallway stretched out before me, silent, still. The only light came from a small lamp at the end, casting a dim glow that barely reached the corners. I stood there for a moment, frozen in place, half expecting something to lunge out of the shadows. But there was nothing, just the oppressive quiet of the house. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to take a step forward, even though everything in me screamed to stay still. The air felt wrong, heavy, like I was walking through something unseen, something waiting. I moved down the hall, checking each room as I passed. The doors creaked open slowly, revealing nothing but darkness, empty spaces. Yet it felt like something was shifting just out of sight, as though the house itself was breathing, watching. I found myself holding my breath as I turned each knob, my pulse quickening with each door. But every room was the same, untouched, abandoned by any sign of life. It made no sense, but the sensation of being followed refused to leave. I could feel eyes on me, even though there were none to be found. Back in the bedroom, I shut the door behind me, leaning against it for a moment, trying to calm my racing heart. I was letting the house get to me, that was all. I hadn't slept well since I moved in, and it was messing with my head. That's what I told myself anyway. Still, there was no denying the unease had settled deep into my bones, making it impossible to relax. I walked over to the window, pulling back the curtain just enough to peek outside. The street was empty, the other houses dark. It was late, past midnight, and not a single light flickered on the road. But then I saw it, movement. Across the street, near the edge of the trees, a figure stood, barely visible in the dim moonlight. It didn't move, just stood there, watching. A cold dread crept up my spine as I stared back, waiting for some indication it was just a trick of the light. But no, it was real. I blinked, and the figure was gone, leaving nothing but the stillness of the night behind. My stomach twisted into knots, every instinct screaming that something was wrong, deeply wrong. I yanked the curtain shut, trying to push down the rising panic. My mind raced. Who was it? Why were they watching my house? And why did it feel like this presence was more than just a stranger lurking in the shadows? I lay back down, pulling the blanket up to my chin like it could protect me from whatever was outside. The house felt alive again, like it was waiting for me to acknowledge what I didn't want to admit. I could almost hear it breathing, a low hum beneath the silence, like something waiting for the right moment to show itself. Sleep wouldn't come, not after what I saw. The figure was still out there somewhere, and the unsettling truth settled over me. I wasn't alone in this house. The next morning, I woke up with a gnawing sense of unease, like the night had left something behind. My head throbbed from lack of sleep, my thoughts still tangled with the image of that figure outside. I couldn't shake the feeling that it had been real, that someone or something had been standing there, watching me. I tried to tell myself it was just a trick of the shadows, but the doubt lingered, settling deep in my chest like a weight I couldn't shake. I went through the motions of getting ready for the day, but everything felt wrong. The house felt different in the daylight. It was quieter, almost too quiet, as if the walls were holding their breath, waiting. I caught myself listening for the creaks and groans that used to feel so normal, but now they carried an edge of menace. Every sound seemed sharper, more deliberate, as though the house was trying to get my attention. And that door, the one that had closed on its own, I couldn't bring myself to check it again. As I sat down at the kitchen table, sipping coffee that tasted bitter and metallic, I found myself staring out the window, half expecting to see that figure again. But the street was empty, the trees swaying gently in the morning breeze. Everything looked normal, but I knew better. Normal didn't exist in this house anymore. Not after last night. I picked up my phone and dialed the office, planning to tell them I'd be late. My voice sounded strained as I left a message for my boss, the words feeling hollow. Work seemed like a distant concern now, a place far removed from whatever was happening in this house. I couldn't focus on anything except the strange tension that had settled over me, the nagging feeling that something was watching me even now. By the afternoon, I couldn't take it anymore. I had to know. There had to be an explanation for what was happening. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe the house was just old and my mind was playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew there was something more, something I hadn't uncovered yet. So I started searching, online articles, local records, anything I could find about the house. And that's when I stumbled across her name, Elizabeth Hawthorne. There wasn't much at first, just mentions of a woman accused of witchcraft centuries ago, one of many caught up in the infamous Salem trials. But as I dug deeper, the details became more unsettling. She had lived near this part of town, executed after being accused by her neighbors of dark rituals, of manipulating the unseen forces in the world. The records hinted that she might have cursed the land before her death, that her spirit had never truly left, that people who lived in the area sometimes spoke of seeing her, of feeling her presence, long after she was gone. I leaned back in my chair, my mind reeling. The figure I'd seen, could it have been her? The idea sounded absurd, but after everything I'd experienced, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was a connection. Elizabeth's name whispered through my thoughts like a shadow, pulling at something deep within me. That night, the air felt thicker, heavier, as if the house itself was breathing around me. Every creak, every groan of the floorboards seemed louder, more deliberate. The unease that had taken root in me was now spreading, making it impossible to think clearly. Elizabeth Hawthorne's name clung to my thoughts like a curse, and no matter how much I tried to shake it off, she was there, just beneath the surface of everything. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, waiting for sleep that wouldn't come. My mind raced through everything I'd read earlier, piecing together fragments of history, local legends, whispers about a woman who never left the place where she died. It all sounded ridiculous, but deep down it made a sick kind of sense. The figure I saw, the cold spots, the door. This wasn't just my imagination. It couldn't be. Something was here, something tied to that name, and it wasn't going to let go. Suddenly, a sound broke through the silence, soft but unmistakable, a faint knock. My heart lurched into my throat as I sat up, listening. The knock came again, louder this time, echoing down the hall. I didn't want to move, didn't want to open the door, but my body betrayed me. I swung my legs over the side of the bed, every step feeling like I was moving through water. The air was colder now, biting at my skin, pushing me toward the source of the sound. I opened the bedroom door slowly, the hallway stretching out before me in the dim light. It felt wrong, like the space had shifted, growing longer, darker. The knock came again from downstairs this time, the same slow, deliberate rhythm. My stomach twisted, every instinct telling me to stay put, to lock the door and wait for morning. But something pulled me forward, something I couldn't explain. I reached the bottom of the stairs, the living room bathed in shadows. The front door was cracked open, just a sliver, like an invitation. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat louder than the last. I took a step toward it, my breath shallow, every nerve screaming at me to stop. But I didn't. My hand reached for the knob, and I pulled the door open wider, bracing myself for whatever might be waiting on the other side. Nothing. Just the empty street, the cold wind brushing against my skin. But before I could close it, something caught my eye. On the doorstep, where no one had been a second ago, there was something small, something dark. I knelt down, hesitating before reaching for it. It was a piece of paper, folded neatly, old and worn. My fingers trembled as I opened it. Scrawled across the page, in a script that looked like it had been written centuries ago, was a single sentence: "You cannot escape her." I stood there, staring at the note, my hands shaking. The wind tugged at the edges of the paper, but the words stayed burned into my mind. You cannot escape her. The reality of it hit me hard, like the house itself had decided to show its cards. The figure outside, the cold spots, the shifting shadows, it had all been leading to this. I wasn't just imagining things. Something was here, and it had been watching me, waiting for the right moment to let me know it was in control. I closed the door, locking it with trembling fingers, but it didn't make me feel any safer. The house felt smaller now, as if the walls were closing in, suffocating me. I wanted to run, to get out, but where would I go? And would it even matter? I could feel her presence, Elizabeth Hawthorne, like a weight pressing down on me from all sides. She wasn't just haunting the house, she was haunting me. The realization sent a cold wave of dread through me. This wasn't a ghost story you could run from. I sat down at the kitchen table, the note still crumpled in my hand, trying to make sense of it all. Why me? Why now? There had to be something I was missing. My mind raced back to the research I'd done, the fragments of history I'd found. Elizabeth had been accused of witchcraft, condemned without a trial, tortured until she confessed to crimes she never committed. And now, centuries later, she was reaching across time, and for some reason, I was the one she'd chosen. I wanted to scream, to demand answers from the empty room, but instead, I sat there, frozen, as the reality of my situation sunk in. This wasn't just about the house. There was something deeper, something personal about her torment. That's when it hit me, the connection. The thought came uninvited, unwelcome, but undeniable. My family had lived in Salem for generations. Could it be that one of my ancestors had been involved in her death? It made too much sense. The rage, the vengeance, it was all directed at me because of what my bloodline had done. The room felt colder. I stood up, my breath visible in the air, and I felt her before I saw her. A shape at the edge of the kitchen, standing in the doorway, barely more than a shadow, but I knew it was her. Elizabeth. I couldn't move, couldn't look away. Her presence filled the room, heavy, oppressive. My heart pounded in my chest, but it was useless. There was no running from this. A voice, faint at first but unmistakable, broke through the silence. "You cannot escape me, Christopher." The words wrapped around me, choking the air from my lungs. She stepped closer, the figure becoming more defined, her eyes locked on mine. I felt the floor shift beneath me, as if the whole house was warping under her control. My mind raced, searching for something, anything I could do to break free, but there was nothing. She had me. And then, in a voice that was no longer faint but absolute, she whispered the final words that sealed my fate. "You belong to me now." The walls seemed to close in, the darkness thickening around her figure. I could feel myself slipping, the last grip on reality loosening as her voice echoed in my mind. The last thing I remember was the cold, that unbearable, crushing cold. Then nothing. I still remember the day I decided to do it, alone. No guides, no company, just me and the mountain. It wasn't just about the climb. I needed the solitude, a break from the constant noise of everyday life. My job, my family, the pressure to always be on. I thought the isolation would be refreshing. Turns out, no idea what real isolation felt like. The trail started out simple enough. A steep incline, dense trees on both sides. The air was cool, crisp even. It felt good. I could hear the crunch of the earth beneath my boots, the faint rustle of leaves, and the occasional bird call. It was peaceful, the kind of quiet that feels like a gift. I pushed forward, trying not to think too much. I didn't want to overanalyze. Just climb, breathe, and keep moving. But after a few hours, something shifted. The forest started to change. The air felt heavier, like it was pressing down on me. The trees seemed closer, their branches intertwining, forming a ceiling over my head. The sounds, too, began to fade. No birds, no wind, just silence, complete and suffocating. It felt wrong, like the mountain itself was holding its breath. I tried to brush it off, kept telling myself I was just being paranoid. I mean, I've been in the wild before, and nature can play tricks on you when you're alone. But deep down, something felt off. I paused to drink some water, glancing around, trying to shake the uneasy feeling creeping up my spine. That's when I noticed it. A shadow, just out of the corner of my eye, slipping between the trees. I whipped my head around, but there was nothing there. "Get a grip, Emily," I muttered under my breath, trying to laugh it off. "It's just the woods." But the shadow, it didn't feel like my imagination, and that's what scared me. I forced myself to keep moving, but now every step felt heavier. My legs felt like lead, and my heart pounded in my chest. I wasn't tired. I was afraid. And the worst part, I couldn't explain why. Every few minutes, I'd catch that shadow again, always at the edge of my vision, never clear, always just slipping away before I could focus on it. I stopped again, this time to listen. Nothing. No animals, no rustling leaves, no distant calls. Just silence, thick and unnatural. And then, almost too quiet to hear, there was a sound. A faint crunch, like someone stepping on a twig behind me. I froze. My mind raced, but my body refused to move. Was it an animal, a person, my imagination? Slowly I turned around, but the trail behind me was empty. I laughed again, but it felt forced, hollow. "This is stupid," I told myself, out loud this time, my voice trembling a bit. "There's nothing here." But I didn't believe it. Something was watching me. I could feel it. The climb that had once seemed exciting now felt like a trap. I don't know when the panic really set in, but I remember the moment I realized I wasn't alone. It was late in the afternoon. The sun had started to dip behind the mountain, casting long shadows that stretched across the trail. I had stopped again, not because I was tired, but because I had to. That feeling, that crushing weight of being watched, was unbearable. It wasn't just a shadow anymore. It was something more, something I couldn't explain. And the silence, it wasn't right. I stood there, gripping my backpack straps, trying to steady my breathing. Maybe it's just the altitude messing with your head, I thought. But even I knew that was a lie. My heart was racing, not from the climb, but from the unmistakable sense that something was following me, watching me. The worst part was, I couldn't see it. There was nothing there. Just trees, endless trees, their branches like twisted arms reaching out of the earth. And yet, I felt it. I pressed on, faster now, hoping that if I kept moving it would shake the fear. But the faster I walked, the more I could hear it. Faint at first, like footsteps, mirroring my own. Soft, deliberate, staying just behind me. My mind raced, desperately trying to rationalize it. Maybe it was another hiker, someone who had taken a different path and was just out of view. But who would be out here? I hadn't seen a single person all day, not since I started. I stopped abruptly, spinning around, half expecting to see someone standing there. But again, nothing. No movement, no sound, just the quiet. Too quiet. I swallowed hard, feeling the dryness in my throat. "Hello?" My voice sounded small, lost in the vastness of the forest. No answer, not even an echo. I turned back, trying to convince myself I was being ridiculous, but that didn't stop the unease crawling up my spine. Each step felt heavier than the last. The trail seemed to stretch on forever, winding through the dense woods, leading me deeper into something I didn't understand. I kept telling myself I was fine, that it was all in my head. But even as I thought it, I knew it wasn't true. As I neared the ridge, something shifted. The air grew colder, and the light dimmed quicker than it should have. My skin prickled, the kind of cold that sinks deep, even though I was sweating from the climb. I paused, scanning the trees again, hoping to catch a glimpse of whatever was out there. And then I heard it, this low, guttural sound. Not human, not animal. It was like breathing, deep, raspy, and close, too close. I froze, my pulse pounding in my ears. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I couldn't move. My legs locked up, and my hands shook. The sound was getting louder, like whatever it was had finally decided to stop hiding. I couldn't breathe. My chest felt tight, like the air around me had thickened, weighing down on my lungs. That sound, whatever it was, seemed to vibrate through the trees, low and rhythmic, pulsing in time with my racing heartbeat. It was closer now, no longer hidden in the distance, no longer subtle. I wanted to run, but where? The trail ahead was a winding blur, and behind me, I didn't dare look again. "Move, Emily," I whispered, but my legs wouldn't obey. Every muscle was locked, frozen in place, like my body knew something my mind refused to accept. "It's not real," I told myself, over and over. "It's just the mountain. It's just the isolation playing tricks." But deep down, I knew this wasn't some trick. There was something here. Something old. Something that didn't want me here. I finally forced myself to take a step forward, then another. My legs felt like they were moving through water, slow, unsteady. I had to get to the ridge. I kept telling myself if I just made it to the ridge, I'd be able to see everything, maybe even find some sense of control again. But every step made that breathing sound grow louder, deeper, almost like it was right behind me, breathing down my neck. I stopped again, my heart pounding so hard I could barely hear anything over it. The forest was still, like the entire world had gone quiet, waiting. I turned slowly, forcing myself to face whatever was there. But there was nothing. No movement, no shadows, just the same tangled mess of trees and rocks. Yet, I could feel it, the weight of it. Something watching, something waiting. "Please." I didn't even realize I'd spoken until I heard my own voice, weak and cracking. I wasn't sure what I was begging for. For it to stop, for it to show itself, for me to wake up from whatever nightmare this was. And then, just as suddenly as it started, the breathing stopped. The air around me seemed to shift, lighter somehow, but colder too. I didn't dare move, didn't dare even take a breath. The silence wasn't comforting. It was the kind of silence that held something terrible, just out of sight, just out of reach, but you knew it was still there, waiting. I turned back to the trail and started walking, faster this time. My legs finally moved, though every step felt like it could be my last. My mind was a whirl of thoughts I couldn't control, images of dark, twisted shapes lurking in the trees, unseen hands reaching for me, voices I couldn't quite hear whispering just out of reach. But none of it was real. It couldn't be. I was just alone, too alone, and my mind was trying to fill in the gaps. That's all. I thought reaching the ridge would bring some relief, that seeing the horizon stretch out beneath me would somehow calm the dread gnawing at my insides. But when I got there, nothing felt better. If anything, it was worse. The view was stunning, sure, endless peaks, valleys stretching into the distance, but it all felt wrong. The sky had turned this sickly gray, like the sun couldn't fully break through. The wind barely moved, heavy with a strange stillness, and the quiet, that damn quiet, was suffocating. I dropped my pack, hands shaking as I fumbled for water. My throat was dry, the taste of panic lingering on my tongue. "Okay," I muttered, trying to ground myself. "Just take a breath. You're fine, you're fine." But even as I said it, I didn't believe it. I couldn't. I felt exposed, like something was staring right through me, waiting for me to make a move. I spun around, scanning the tree line. Nothing moved, nothing shifted, but I couldn't shake the feeling. It was there, lurking just beyond my sight, just beyond where I could reach it. My mind raced, trying to think of a reason, any reason, why I was feeling this way. Maybe I was dehydrated. Maybe the altitude was messing with my head. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. Something was here. I don't know why I spoke again. Maybe it was just to break the silence, but I couldn't help myself. "I know you're there," I called out, my voice sounding braver than I felt. "What do you want?" My words hung in the air, swallowed by the emptiness around me. No reply, no sound, just that oppressive silence pushing in from every direction. My skin prickled, and I had to resist the urge to run. I didn't even know where I'd go. I forced myself to sit down, legs trembling, my back against a rock. I thought if I could just rest for a moment, maybe the fear would pass. But as I sat there, the quiet pressed in harder. The shadows between the trees seemed deeper now, darker. I stared at them, waiting for something to move, something to reveal itself, but nothing did. Not yet, anyway. My mind started to race again. Images of dark figures, faceless and silent, creeping up behind me, reaching out for me with fingers cold as stone. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to block it out, trying to make it stop. "It's not real. None of it is real," I whispered to myself, over and over. But the truth was, it felt real. Every part of me was screaming to get away, to get off this mountain, but I couldn't. Not yet. Something was holding me here. Something wouldn't let me leave. I don't know how long I sat there, huddled against the rock, staring into the trees. Time had lost its shape, stretching into something that didn't make sense. Minutes, hours. I couldn't tell anymore. All I knew was that the weight on my chest hadn't lifted. It was still there, pressing down, reminding me that something was watching, waiting. I wanted to stand up, to keep moving, but every time I tried to gather the strength, my legs refused. Fear had settled deep in my bones, freezing me in place. And then, out of nowhere, I heard it again, the breathing. That low, guttural sound, not quite human, not quite animal. But this time it wasn't distant, it was close, so close that I felt it vibrate in my chest, each inhale and exhale shaking me to my core. I didn't want to look. I didn't want to turn my head and see what was standing behind me. But I had to. Something inside me, some sick curiosity, forced me to move. I turned slowly, every muscle in my body tight with dread. At first I didn't see anything. The ridge was empty, the trail stretched out like it always had. But then I saw it. A figure, standing just at the edge of the trees. Dark, twisted, almost like a shadow that had pulled itself free from the ground. It didn't move, didn't even seem to breathe, but I could feel its eyes on me. Cold, ancient eyes that felt more like hands digging into my skin. I couldn't speak. My throat was tight, my mouth dry. All I could do was stare, locked in place by some invisible force. The figure stood there, motionless, but I knew it was waiting for something. For me to do something. I tried to think, tried to rationalize, but nothing made sense. It wasn't a person. It wasn't an animal. It was something else. Something old and angry. Something that had been here long before me. I wasn't supposed to be here. I'd crossed a line, and now it wanted me to pay. Suddenly, I felt the ground shift beneath me. A low rumble, like the mountain itself was waking up. Rocks started to fall from the ridge above, tumbling down in a slow, deliberate pattern. I looked around frantically, trying to find a way out, but there was nowhere to go. The path ahead was blocked, and behind me, the figure was gone, disappeared, like it had never been there. But I knew better. It hadn't left. It was closer now. I could feel it. Panic surged through me, my body finally breaking free from the paralysis. I scrambled to my feet, grabbing my pack and stumbling forward. I didn't care where I was going anymore. I just needed to move, to get away. But every step felt heavier than the last, like the mountain itself was dragging me down. My legs burned, my lungs screamed, but I couldn't stop. Not now. And then, just as I thought I'd broken free, I felt it. A hand, cold, rough, and impossibly strong, grabbing my ankle, yanking me back with a force that knocked the wind out of me. I hit the ground hard, my face scraping against the jagged rocks. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. I clawed at the dirt, kicking, fighting, but it was no use. The hand pulled me deeper into the shadows, and the last thing I saw before the darkness swallowed me whole was the figure, standing over me, silent and waiting. When I first got the call about inheriting my grandfather's house, it didn't feel real. I hadn't spoken to him in years, not since that strange argument we had at a family gathering. But there it was, the house, isolated by a lake in the Adirondacks, was now mine. I figured it would be a great escape from the city. Fix it up, use it as a weekend spot. Simple. The drive out there was longer than I remembered, winding roads and thick trees swallowing up the sunlight as I got closer. When I finally pulled up, the place looked tired. The shutters hung crooked, and the paint had faded to a dull gray. Still, there was something about it, a charm maybe, like it was waiting to be brought back to life. But the air around it was heavy, like the quiet had weight to it. I stepped out of the car, and that's when I felt it for the first time. A strange sensation, like someone was watching me from the tree line. I looked around, but nothing moved. I told myself I was just on edge from the long trip. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling as I walked up to the front door. My hand hovered over the doorknob, hesitating for no reason I could explain. "It's just a house," I muttered under my breath, forcing myself to turn the key. Inside, the house smelled like dust and damp wood. Everything was exactly as I remembered it, down to the old clock on the mantel that hadn't worked in decades. I wandered through the rooms, trying to picture how I'd renovate, but something felt off. The shadows seemed to stretch longer than they should, the corners darker. I brushed it off. The place just needed light, some fresh air. I dropped my bags in the hallway and stepped out to the back porch, staring at the lake. It was calm, not a ripple in sight. As I stood there, I caught a glimpse of movement from the corner of my eye. My heart skipped a beat, but when I turned, there was nothing, just the trees swaying slightly in the wind. "You're jumpy," I told myself, trying to laugh it off, but the knot in my stomach tightened. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard the faintest sound, like footsteps creaking on old floorboards. I lay there, frozen, staring at the ceiling, straining to hear. It wasn't loud, barely there, but enough to keep me awake, my mind racing. It's an old house, I reasoned, but deep down, something didn't feel right. In the middle of the night, I got up to get water. As I passed by the living room window, I glanced outside. The moonlight shimmered on the lake, and for a split second, I thought I saw something standing near the water. A figure, pale and still. My breath caught in my throat. I blinked, and it was gone. The next morning, I tried to convince myself that what I saw by the lake was just a trick of the light. Maybe I was tired, maybe it was nothing at all. But the unease lingered. I spent the day cleaning, moving through the house with this nagging sense that something was off. Every room felt wrong, like it was holding a secret just beneath the surface. The more time I spent inside, the more it felt like the walls were closing in. I had the radio playing to drown out the silence, but even that seemed hollow in the space. Every now and then, the signal would cut out for no reason, leaving me standing there, frozen, listening to the static. It wasn't loud, but it felt intrusive, like it was pushing into my thoughts. When it happened for the third time, I turned it off completely, deciding that silence was better than whatever that was. By midday, I needed air. The house felt stifling, oppressive, so I headed outside to clear my head. The lake looked peaceful in the sunlight, almost inviting, but the memory of that figure from last night stuck with me. I tried not to look at the water for too long, afraid that I might see something again. Instead, I focused on fixing the porch railing, trying to stay busy. As I worked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. It wasn't just a vague paranoia, it was something more specific, like eyes were on me, watching every move I made. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to catch someone there, but every time, it was just empty space. The air felt too still, like the world had paused for a moment. I didn't want to admit it, but I was spooked. "Get a grip," I muttered, shaking my head. "You're acting like a kid afraid of the dark." But the truth was, I couldn't shake the dread that had settled deep in my chest. Something about this place didn't feel right, and the more I tried to ignore it, the stronger it got. Later that evening, as the sun began to dip behind the trees, the house seemed to change. The shadows stretched longer, swallowing up the light, and that familiar feeling of being watched returned, heavier than before. I kept telling myself it was just the isolation, the silence playing tricks on me. But when I walked past the old grandfather clock in the hall and heard a faint ticking sound, I stopped dead in my tracks. That clock hadn't worked in years. I remembered it clearly from when I was a kid. It was broken. No one ever bothered to fix it. So why now, in the middle of an empty house, was I hearing it tick? I stood there, heart racing, listening to the steady rhythm that shouldn't have been there. "This can't be happening," I whispered, feeling a cold sweat break out on the back of my neck. But the ticking continued, relentless, echoing through the hallway. I stood there, frozen in the hallway, listening to the ticking that shouldn't exist. The sound was soft but unmistakable, cutting through the silence of the house. My chest tightened with each beat, the rhythm filling the space between my thoughts, making it hard to think clearly. That clock had been silent for decades. Why now? I stepped closer, my hand trembling as I reached for the pendulum. It swung gently, like it had always been working. But I knew better. I'd stared at that clock for hours as a kid, waiting for it to chime, for it to do anything. It never did. Yet here it was, ticking like it had never stopped. "This isn't possible," I whispered to myself, feeling the weight of the words sink into my bones. My fingers brushed the wood, cold to the touch, as if the air around it was somehow different. I wanted to smash it, tear it apart, anything to stop that sound. But I couldn't move. I stood there, watching the pendulum sway, hypnotized by its movement. That's when I heard something else, a faint shuffle behind me. My heart jumped, and I spun around, but the hallway was empty. The hair on the back of my neck stood up as I felt that familiar, suffocating presence. I wasn't alone. I could feel it now, stronger than ever. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice cracking more than I intended. Silence. No footsteps, no voices, just the ticking of the clock behind me, relentless. I backed away, keeping my eyes on the hallway, half expecting something to emerge from the shadows, but nothing came. My breath felt shallow, like the air in the house had grown thick, pressing against my lungs. I needed answers. I wasn't going to make it through another night like this, not without understanding what was happening. My grandfather had lived here for years, right up until he died, and I couldn't help but wonder, had he known? Had he experienced this too? There had to be something here, something he left behind, a clue to explain all of this. Rushing upstairs, I made my way to the old study, where he used to spend hours writing letters, doing God knows what. The door creaked open, revealing the room just as it had been the last time I saw it. Dusty shelves lined with books, papers scattered across the desk like he'd only stepped away for a moment. But it was the drawer on the far left that caught my eye. I don't know why, but I was drawn to it, like I knew something was inside. I yanked it open, and there, buried beneath a stack of old letters, was a small leather journal. My hands shook as I picked it up, the worn cover creasing under my fingers. I flipped through the pages, and that's when I saw it. Entries, all in my grandfather's handwriting, detailing strange occurrences in the house. The ticking clock, shadows that moved on their own, whispers in the night. He'd been living with it all this time, and he never told anyone. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. Whatever was happening here, it wasn't new. It had been waiting. As I read through my grandfather's journal, the fear I felt was overshadowed by a creeping realization. His entries were meticulous, each detail more unnerving than the last. He described shadows that moved on their own, strange sounds that echoed through the house, and a growing sense of being watched. It was all too familiar. It mirrored everything I had been experiencing since I arrived. The journal wasn't just a record, it was a cry for help. One entry stood out in particular, written in hurried, almost frantic handwriting. "The lake holds something," it read. "It watches, waiting. The presence is getting stronger." I stared at those words, my pulse quickening. Was the lake the source of all this? The figure I saw by the water suddenly seemed more menacing. My mind raced through the implications. What was my grandfather involved in, and why had he never sought help? I slammed the journal shut, my hands shaking. I had to confront whatever was in this house, but I needed more than just scribbled notes to understand it. My grandfather's notes hinted at something buried deep. But what? The ticking clock, the whispers, it all had to mean something. That night, sleep came fitfully. I kept tossing and turning, haunted by the images from the journal. I could barely keep my eyes closed before waking up with a start, convinced I heard someone moving around. It was always the same, a creak in the hallway, a shadow in the corner of my eye. I tried to dismiss it, but it was as if the house itself was taunting me. Around midnight, the pressure became unbearable. I decided to check the house again, looking for anything that might explain the strange phenomena. I started in the basement, a place I had avoided until now. The air was thick and damp, the walls lined with old, musty boxes. I shone my flashlight around, the beam flickering against the darkness. The sensation of being watched intensified as I moved deeper into the shadows. In the back corner, half buried under a pile of old blankets, I found a rusty old box. It was locked, but a small key lay beside it, almost like it was waiting for me. With trembling hands, I unlocked the box and lifted the lid. Inside, there were old photographs, yellowed and brittle, and a bundle of letters, all addressed to someone named Eleanor. I didn't recognize the name, but the photographs showed my grandfather with a woman I didn't know, standing by the lake. The final photograph was the most disturbing, a woman's face, pale and ghostly, her eyes wide with an expression of terror. It was then I understood. Whatever was here, whatever my grandfather had tried to hide, was connected to this woman and to the lake. The fear was overwhelming, but I had no choice. I had to uncover the truth. The house was pushing back, but I couldn't stop now. I needed to confront whatever was lurking in the shadows, whatever was tied to that lake. The journal had hinted at a presence growing stronger, and I had to find out if that meant more than just the eerie feeling of being watched. I spent the next day in a daze, grappling with the unsettling discovery in the box. The photographs and letters hinted at something dark and twisted, and the face of that woman, haunting, desperate, kept replaying in my mind. The connection to the lake was undeniable. It seemed to be the center of whatever was wrong here, the place where my grandfather's sins, or perhaps something worse, had taken root. Determined to confront whatever was lurking, I decided to revisit the lake. I approached it with a mix of dread and resolve, the morning sun casting long shadows on the water. The surface was disturbingly calm, almost too calm. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting for me beneath the stillness. Every step toward the edge felt like I was walking into the jaws of a trap. I peered into the water, searching for any sign of the figure I had seen. My reflection wavered, merging with the ripples on the surface. The eerie calm was shattered by a sudden splash. My heart raced as I scanned the lake, but there was nothing, just the peaceful expanse of water. The stillness was oppressive, almost mocking. It felt as if the lake itself was holding its breath, waiting for me to do something, anything. As I turned to leave, a shiver ran down my spine. I heard a sound, clear, deliberate, like a whisper carried on the wind. I stopped and looked back, but the lake was still. I stepped away, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination. "Get a grip," I said aloud, trying to steady my nerves. But I couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling that something was terribly wrong. Back at the house, I returned to the journal. The more I read, the more it became apparent that my grandfather had been trying to protect me from something. His entries spoke of rituals, sacrifices, and a spirit bound to the lake. The last entry was scrawled hurriedly, as if written in a state of panic. "They are coming for me. They know. The lake is calling. I must go to the depths before they find me." I realized, with a sinking dread, that my grandfather's efforts to hide the truth had failed. The spirit he spoke of was not merely a ghost. It was something far more sinister, something that thrived on fear and secrecy. I had uncovered a part of the house's dark legacy, but the full extent of the horror was still unfolding. I glanced at the clock, its ticking now a constant, unsettling presence in my thoughts. The realization hit me like a cold wave. The clock wasn't just marking time, it was counting down. The final revelation struck me as I stood by the lake, the water's surface reflecting the twilight. The figure I saw, the spirit my grandfather feared, was connected to the lake's depths. It wasn't merely waiting, it was drawing me in. The true horror of the house wasn't the eerie sounds or the fleeting shadows. It was the very lake itself, a dark force that had ensnared my grandfather and now sought to claim me. As night fell, I felt the weight of the presence grow stronger. Whatever was out there, whatever had been calling from the depths, was closer than ever. I never thought I'd be the kind of person to believe in things like this. The stories you hear about lights in the sky, alien encounters, they all felt like nonsense. That's what I told myself anyway. It's easy to brush off when you've spent years behind the wheel, crossing endless miles of highway. But there I was, driving along Highway 375, also known as the extraterrestrial highway, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't sure if I could explain what I was seeing. The storm had come out of nowhere, heavy rain slamming against the windshield, making it almost impossible to see. I could hear the wind howling outside, pushing the truck side to side. My hands were white-knuckled on the steering wheel, and I remember thinking, why the hell did I take this route tonight? But there was no turning back. The desert stretched out on both sides, an endless void, and the highway was the only thread of civilization. At least, that's what I thought. I first noticed the lights around midnight. At first, they were just faint, like reflections off the rain. I figured it was lightning, or maybe the headlights of some car far off the road. But they didn't move like car lights. They didn't flicker like lightning either. They just hovered. I squinted, trying to get a better look, but they vanished as soon as I focused on them. I told myself it was nothing, probably my eyes playing tricks in the storm, but a chill crept down my spine that I couldn't shake. I kept driving, the rhythmic thud of the windshield wipers the only sound besides the rain. The road was empty, no other cars, no signs of life. Just me, the storm, and that unsettling feeling creeping into my bones. Every few miles, I thought I saw something, dark shapes standing along the side of the road. But when I'd glance in the rearview mirror, there'd be nothing. My stomach knotted tighter with each passing minute. It's just the storm, I muttered to myself. You're tired. You've been driving too long. But I wasn't tired. Not like this. The air felt heavy, like something was wrong. I glanced at the clock, 12:37 in morning. Too late to turn back, too far from anywhere. The lights appeared again, this time closer. 3, maybe 4 of them, hovering over the desert, moving in ways that didn't make sense. My heart pounded against my chest, my breathing shallow. What the hell is that? Then it happened. The truck jolted, the engine sputtered, and everything went silent. No rumble from the engine, no hum from the radio, just silence. I coasted to a stop, gripping the wheel so tight my hands hurt. The rain kept falling, hammering the roof, but inside the cab, everything felt wrong. I tried turning the key, but the engine didn't even click. Dead. For the first time in years, I felt real fear. This wasn't some minor inconvenience. Something was out there, and I was stranded, alone in the middle of nowhere. I stared out into the desert, eyes wide, searching for any sign of life. Those lights, they were still there, still watching. I sat there, gripping the steering wheel as if holding on for dear life would somehow make the truck start again. But it didn't. I stared out into the rain, eyes darting between those strange lights in the distance. They hadn't moved. They just hung there, like they were waiting for something. Waiting for me? The thought hit me hard, and I shook my head, trying to push it away. I wasn't about to let my mind run wild. Not yet. It's just a mechanical issue, I told myself. These things happen, but deep down I knew that wasn't it. Something felt off. Way off. I tried the key again. Nothing. Not even a click. The rain beat down on the roof, steady and unrelenting. I pulled out my phone, praying for a signal. Of course, there was none. No service, just an empty bar taunting me. I threw the phone onto the passenger seat, frustration bubbling up. Great. Just great. I was miles from anyone, stuck on a road with a reputation for all the wrong reasons. And those lights, I couldn't get them out of my head. I glanced at them again, my heart thudding in my chest. They were closer now. It was subtle, but they were definitely moving. Slowly, almost lazily, but heading my way. My breath hitched in my throat, and I felt my hands start to shake. This can't be happening. I wanted to laugh at how ridiculous it all sounded. Aliens, UFOs, whatever the hell those lights were, but the fear was real. It was crawling under my skin, tightening around my chest. I could almost hear my own pulse, loud and fast, like a drumbeat in my ears. I thought about stepping out of the truck, but something stopped me, that primal gut feeling telling me not to. Stay inside. Don't move. But I couldn't just sit there forever. What if it came closer? What then? I shifted in my seat, glancing out the window, half expecting to see something creeping toward me in the rain. Nothing yet, but the feeling of being watched, of something lurking just beyond the edge of my vision, wouldn't let up. Okay, think, I muttered under my breath, trying to calm myself down. Think, Sarah. You've been through worse. This isn't real. It can't be. But no matter how hard I tried to reason with myself, the fear wouldn't go away. I grabbed my flashlight from the glove box, holding it tight, as if the dim beam could somehow protect me from whatever was out there. But I didn't turn it on. Not yet. If something was watching, I didn't want to give away my position. Not until I knew what I was dealing with. And then, just when I thought things couldn't get worse, I heard it. A sound. A faint humming, low and almost rhythmic, coming from somewhere outside. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the rain. It was something else, something mechanical, almost alive. My heart sank. That hum, it wasn't natural. It was too smooth, too precise, like something engineered, but for what? My skin prickled as the sound seemed to pulse through the air, vibrating through the truck's frame. I turned the key again, not expecting anything, and I was right. Dead silence. I stared out into the rain-soaked darkness, flashlight still gripped in my hand, and felt completely helpless. The lights in the sky hadn't moved any closer, but they were still there, hovering, waiting. I need to move. I can't just sit here. My mind raced with options, but none of them seemed good. Stay in the truck and hope help comes? Impossible. There was no one out here for miles, not in this weather. Get out and try to walk? The thought sent a cold wave of dread through me. What if those lights were following me? I shook my head. No, I wasn't ready for that yet. Not with that hum getting louder. I rolled down the window just a crack, enough to let in the cool desert air. The rain immediately spattered onto my arm, but I needed to hear. I needed to know where that sound was coming from. It was louder outside, clearer, and now I could feel it, vibrating through the air, subtle but constant. I strained to see through the sheets of rain, hoping to spot something, anything that would make sense of it. But the road remained empty, stretching out like a black ribbon into the desert, the storm swirling around me. Come on, Sarah. Pull it together, I whispered, my breath shaky. My fingers ached from gripping the flashlight so hard. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to focus. I'd been in tough situations before, blown tires, breakdowns, stranded in the middle of nowhere, but none of that compared to this. This isn't just the truck breaking down, I thought, the panic rising in my throat again. Something's here. I glanced at the lights one more time, and my stomach dropped. They were closer. I hadn't seen them move, but they definitely were. Hovering low, silent, like they were watching me, studying me. I slammed the window shut and locked the doors, my heart pounding against my ribs. What good would that do if they wanted to get in? The thought made me feel ridiculous. I couldn't hide behind a truck door, not from this. The hum deepened, more intense now, and I felt it vibrate through my bones. It was coming from the ground, or at least that's what it felt like the whole desert was humming along with whatever was out there. My thoughts started to blur, disjointed, like I couldn't keep them straight anymore. Fear twisted into something else, something I didn't want to admit. What if they want me to come to them? What if they're waiting for me to step out? I blinked hard, trying to clear my head. The rain had started to let up, but the silence that followed was worse. My mind raced, trying to calculate the odds. Stay in the truck, and I might lose my mind from the waiting, from the feeling of being watched. Step out, and I could be walking right into something I couldn't escape. Either way, I wasn't sure I'd make it through the night. The humming grew louder, more insistent, until it felt like it was vibrating in my chest. I could almost feel the pulse of it, like a heartbeat that wasn't mine. I crouched low in the seat, my flashlight beam cutting through the murky darkness, desperately searching for any sign of what was out there. But the desert remained an unyielding sea of black, only occasionally illuminated by the shifting lights above. My thoughts were spinning out of control. What are they? What do they want? My eyes darted to the rearview mirror, expecting to see something sneaking up behind me, but all I saw was the storm-ravaged landscape. The sensation of being watched was so intense, it was almost physical. I could feel it pressing against my skin, making me shiver. I tried to remind myself that it was just my mind playing tricks, but that didn't stop the cold sweat from forming on my forehead. I grabbed the radio, hoping maybe someone out there would hear me, but the static was all I got. I turned the dial frantically, switching through channels, but nothing broke through the noise. I was alone, completely isolated. The lights had moved again, now seemingly right above me, casting eerie shadows through the truck's windows. I could no longer tell if they were getting closer or if it was just my imagination running wild. The sound outside was like a low drone, almost musical in its rhythm, and I could see faint shapes darting around in the darkness. I tried to convince myself it was just the storm playing tricks on my eyes, but the shapes were too defined, too deliberate. They weren't natural. My breath quickened. Why can't I just get out of here? But the thought of stepping out into that void, into the unknown, paralyzed me. I turned the flashlight on briefly, the beam cutting through the rain and revealing nothing but empty desert. I turned it off, not wanting to give away my position, but the darkness felt heavier, as if my brief intrusion had only made the shadows more oppressive. I could hear the storm dying down, but the sense of dread only grew stronger. Whatever was out there seemed to be taking its time, as if savoring my fear. Suddenly, a loud thud echoed through the truck, making me jump. It felt like something had hit the side of the vehicle. My heart raced as I glanced around, trying to pinpoint the source. The humming stopped, replaced by an unnerving silence. I was left with nothing but the pounding of my own heart and the relentless patter of the rain. I couldn't stay here forever. I need to do something, I thought. I need to find out what's happening. But every option felt like a trap. Every step I considered seemed like a path to something worse. The fear was almost unbearable, twisting my insides. I felt trapped between the safety of the truck and the unknown terror outside. The longer I stayed, the more it seemed like something was inching closer, circling me like a predator. I had to make a choice, but the weight of uncertainty pressed down, making it harder to move. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting for me to make a move, waiting for me to do exactly what I feared the most. The silence outside was deafening, but the tension was more acute than ever. I could feel it crawling up my spine. I was torn between staying hidden in the truck and making a run for it. The storm had reduced to a drizzle, but the fear hadn't subsided. If anything, it had intensified. I couldn't shake the thought that whatever was out there was deliberately biding its time, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Suddenly, a loud mechanical sound broke the stillness, a sharp metallic clang followed by a series of rapid, rhythmic clicks. My heart pounded as I spun around, searching for the source. The noise seemed to come from the rear of the truck, but when I glanced through the back window, all I saw was darkness. It was as if something was toying with me, deliberately keeping itself just out of sight. I couldn't take it any longer. My nerves were frayed. I had to see what was happening. I grabbed the flashlight and slowly opened the door, my breath catching in my throat. The cold night air hit me like a slap, and I forced myself out of the truck, my legs shaky beneath me. The rain had stopped, leaving the ground damp and uneven. I clicked the flashlight on, its beam slicing through the darkness, illuminating the empty stretch of road and the rain-soaked desert around me. But there was still nothing to see, just the oppressive void of the night. I took a few hesitant steps, every sound magnified in the stillness, the crunch of gravel underfoot, the distant rumble of thunder. As I moved, I noticed something on the ground near the truck, small metal fragments scattered around. I bent down to inspect them, my flashlight revealing them to be parts of a strange, metallic object. It looked like something had been dragged along the road, leaving these pieces behind. My breath caught as I heard a low, soft voice behind me. "Sarah, Sarah, help me!" The voice was barely a whisper, almost lost in the wind. I spun around, flashlight beam dancing wildly, but there was no one. My name echoed in my mind, mixing with the frantic beats of my heart. The fear was overwhelming, gripping me like a vice. I had to get out of there, had to find safety, but my feet felt like they were glued to the ground. The humming began again, louder and more insistent than before, as if it was coming from directly above me. I glanced up, and my blood ran cold. The lights that had been hovering in the sky were now much closer, hovering directly overhead. I felt a surge of panic as I realized the lights were not just random. They were forming a pattern, a shape, a perfect symmetrical design. It was as if they were creating a visual code, a message I couldn't understand. In a moment of clarity amid the terror, I noticed something else, a shadow moving behind the lights. It was large, amorphous, and it seemed to be shifting, reacting to the pattern above. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. Whatever was out there wasn't just watching me. It was communicating, sending a signal, and I was the center of its attention. The lights pulsed, and the shadow grew larger, as if drawing closer. My fear turned to a desperate, primal urge to escape, but I was paralyzed, knowing that whatever was out there had no intention of letting me go. I scrambled back to the truck, my hands trembling as I fumbled with the door. As I got inside and locked it, I glanced up one last time. The lights were gone, but the shadow remained, lingering in my mind. I turned the key, praying for the engine to start. It roared to life, and I sped away, not daring to look back. But even as I drove into the night, I knew I would never forget that moment. The sight of those lights, the sound of that voice, the feeling of being watched, it would haunt me forever. The desert was vast, but no matter where I went, I knew that something was out there, waiting, watching, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it would never truly let me go. I've always been drawn to forgotten places. As a photographer, I thrive on capturing what others overlook, the stories hidden in decay and neglect. So when I heard about the abandoned hotel in New Orleans, I knew I had to see it for myself. They called it the Forgotten Hotel, and from what I gathered, its history was as murky as its current state. The hotel stood like a ghost from the past, shrouded in layers of grime and overgrowth. As I approached, the grandeur of its faded facade was still evident, despite the years of neglect. My flashlight barely cut through the oppressive darkness inside. The air was thick with dust, and every step I took seemed to stir up memories long buried. The silence was unnerving, broken only by the occasional creak of the building settling or the distant sound of traffic outside. I set up my camera, hoping to capture the hotel's essence. The hallways stretched endlessly in both directions, lined with peeling wallpaper and forgotten furniture. Each room was a snapshot of a bygone era, filled with cobwebs and the faint scent of mildew. As I snapped away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It was an unsettling sensation, like eyes following me through the darkened corridors. In one of the rooms, I saw something strange through the viewfinder. Shadows seemed to move independently of any light source, writhing and twisting in unnatural ways. I adjusted the camera settings, convinced it was a trick of the light or a glitch, but the shadows remained. They danced and flickered in the photographs, far more vivid than they appeared to the naked eye. My pulse quickened with every click of the shutter. I tried to brush it off, attributing the eerie sensations to my own overactive imagination. But as the night wore on, the hotel seemed to come alive in disturbing ways. Distant laughter echoed through the halls, coming from rooms that were empty and dark. The sound was disjointed, as if played on a loop, and it made my skin crawl. I could hear footsteps too, dragging and uneven, as if someone or something was shuffling through the hallways. Every time I tried to locate the source of these sounds, the hotel fell eerily silent. I would stand there, holding my breath, straining to hear anything over the pounding of my own heart. The emptiness was almost suffocating. I began to question my own sanity. Was this place really haunted, or was I just imagining things? I knew I should leave, but curiosity drove me to press on. The allure of uncovering the hotel's secrets was too strong, even as the feeling of being watched grew more intense with each passing moment. I decided to spend the night at the hotel, hoping that the quiet of darkness would help me capture its essence. I set up my equipment in what used to be a grand ballroom, now filled with dust and decay. The moonlight filtered through the cracked windows, casting eerie shadows across the room. I tried to focus on the task at hand, but the uneasy feeling that had been creeping up on me since I arrived was now impossible to ignore. As I reviewed the photos I'd taken, I noticed something unsettling. In the corner of one shot, a shadowy figure seemed to be moving, even though the room had been empty. I frowned, checked the camera settings again, and took another shot. But the figure was still there. My breath quickened. I knew it couldn't be a mistake or a glitch. I wanted to believe it was just an optical illusion, but deep down, I felt something was terribly wrong. A A chill swept through the ballroom, and I shivered despite the heat. I heard what sounded like a muffled conversation coming from a distant part of the hotel. The voices were indistinct, but there was a cruel, mocking edge to them that made my skin crawl. I followed the sound, but when I reached the source, all I found was an empty hallway. The whispers stopped abruptly, leaving behind only the sound of my own heartbeat in the silence. Determined to get to the bottom of this, I pressed on. I found a staircase leading down to the basement, which was shrouded in darkness. The air grew colder as I descended, and each step felt heavier than the last. My flashlight flickered intermittently, casting jittery beams of light across the walls. The basement was a labyrinth of storage rooms and old furniture covered in sheets. I thought I saw figures darting in and out of the shadows, but when I looked directly, there was nothing. Every noise seemed amplified in the basement. The creaking of the floorboards, the soft rustling of rats, and the distant thud of something heavy being dragged. My nerves were on edge, and I began to doubt my decision to stay. I tried to rationalize everything. Maybe it was just the isolation getting to me, or perhaps the stories I'd heard about the hotel were influencing my mind. I headed back to the ballroom, hoping that maybe a fresh perspective would calm my nerves. But as soon as I stepped into the room, I noticed something odd. The furniture I had carefully arranged was now scattered, as if someone or something had been moving around. I looked at my watch. It was well past midnight. I could feel a presence, an oppressive weight that seemed to fill the space. I glanced around, trying to keep my composure, but the realization hit me. Whatever was here, it didn't want me to leave with the secrets I was uncovering. As I tried to steady my breath, I noticed that the temperature in the ballroom had dropped significantly. My camera's lens fogged up slightly from the sudden chill. I set up my equipment again, trying to focus on getting a few more shots, but every click of the shutter felt like it was amplifying the tension in the room. The air was thick with an unnameable dread. A sudden, loud bang from the hallway jolted me out of my reverie. My heart pounded as I turned towards the noise. It was coming from a nearby room, one I hadn't yet explored. I crept down the hall, each step echoing in the oppressive silence. When I reached the door, I hesitated, feeling a strange sense of foreboding. I couldn't see anything through the small window in the door, but I could hear something, a low, rhythmic thumping. Gathering my courage, I pushed the door open. The room was a mess, with overturned furniture and scattered papers. In the corner, I noticed a figure standing very still, shrouded in shadows. My breath caught in my throat. I raised my camera, but the figure was gone when I looked through the viewfinder. I moved further into the room, scanning for any sign of what I had seen. The air was stifling, and my flashlight flickered unpredictably. The unsettling feeling that I was not alone grew stronger. Every creak of the building seemed louder, every shadow darker. I tried to rationalize it, thinking it was just my imagination running wild. But the feeling of being watched was inescapable. I caught glimpses of movement out of the corner of my eye, only to find empty spaces when I looked directly. It was as if the hotel itself was toying with me. I decided to take a break and reviewed the photos I'd taken so far. Many of them were distorted, with strange shapes and figures that didn't match anything I had seen with my own eyes. My hand trembled as I clicked through the images. I wondered if I was becoming paranoid or if there was something genuinely supernatural happening. I needed answers, but the deeper I dug, the more the hotel seemed to fight back. Determined to uncover the truth, I returned to the main floor. The hallway I had just left felt different now, darker and more oppressive. I could hear faint whispers, like conversations just beyond my reach. They were unsettling, almost mocking. The air felt heavy, and the sensation of being followed was overwhelming. I quickened my pace, trying to ignore the growing sense of panic. Every door I opened led to more of the same, rooms in disarray and a creeping sense of dread. It was as if the hotel itself was alive, breathing, shifting in the shadows. My frustration grew with each passing moment. What was this place hiding? And why did it feel so intent on keeping its secrets? I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, waiting for me to slip up. I had to find out what was behind the eerie occurrences before it was too late. I had been exploring the hotel for hours, my footsteps echoing through the empty halls. The once grand lobby had turned into a labyrinth of darkness and decay. Every shadow seemed to move on its own. Every whisper of the wind felt like a taunting laugh. I had almost convinced myself that my imagination was running wild when a chill ran down my spine, snapping me out of my growing paranoia. I followed a faint, unsettling sound that seemed to be coming from behind a door marked private. My flashlight flickered erratically as I approached. The door creaked open slowly, revealing a small office cluttered with dusty papers and broken furniture. A large mirror on one wall caught my attention. It was cracked and dirty, but I couldn't help but be drawn to it. I had always been fascinated by mirrors, especially old ones. They seemed to hold secrets, hidden truths. I set up my camera to capture the room, but as I reviewed the images on the screen, my stomach dropped. The reflection in the mirror showed a shadowy figure standing just behind me. I spun around, but there was no one there. My breathing grew shallow. I tried to convince myself it was a trick of the light or a glitch in the camera, but deep down, I knew something was wrong. The figure in the mirror had been too clear, too distinct. My nerves were frayed, but I pressed on, determined to find answers. The hotel seemed to be shifting around me. Doors I had passed before were now closed, and rooms I had explored were eerily different. I heard a faint rustling sound behind me and turned to see the mirror's reflection shifting. The shadowy figure seemed to move closer, and I could swear I heard its breath, soft, ragged, almost like it was struggling to get out. Desperation set in as I navigated through the crumbling hallways. I felt as if I was being herded, guided by an unseen force. The air grew colder. My flashlight cast long, eerie shadows that danced on the walls. My camera, which had been my lifeline, now seemed to betray me with every click. The images were distorted, full of unnatural shapes and ghostly apparitions. I stumbled upon a stairwell leading to the basement. The stairs creaked under my weight, and the darkness below seemed to swallow the light from my flashlight. Every step was a challenge, my heart racing with each sound. The basement was a vast, empty space with old storage shelves and broken furniture. I noticed an old journal on a dusty desk in the corner, its cover worn and brittle. I picked it up, hoping it might provide some clue. As I flipped through the pages, I realized the journal belonged to a former hotel employee. The entries were filled with bizarre accounts of strange occurrences and disturbing events. The last few pages were smeared with dark, smeary ink, and the words became increasingly erratic. It was clear that whoever had written this had been driven to madness. One sentence stood out. "They won't let me leave. They want their story told." My skin crawled as I read those words. I could feel the oppressive presence of the hotel closing in on me, as if it was aware of my intrusion. The temperature dropped further, and a low, guttural sound echoed through the basement. I had to get out. The realization hit me with full force. The hotel was not just haunted. It was alive, actively guarding its secrets. I knew I had to leave before whatever haunted the hotel decided to trap me for good. My hands shook as I climbed the stairs, clutching the old journal like a lifeline. Each step seemed to groan under the weight of the unseen forces pressing in around me. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see those dark shapes closing in, their breath heavy on my neck. The hotel's oppressive atmosphere followed me, tightening like a noose. When I reached the main floor, I felt a strange pull towards the lobby, where it all began. The space was now eerily quiet, the earlier noises replaced by a heavy silence. The air was suffocating, and the shadows seemed thicker, more menacing. I had hoped that getting back to where I started would help me find a way out, but it only made me more uneasy. I approached the grand chandelier that hung precariously from the ceiling, its crystals now dull and covered in grime. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed through the lobby. I whipped around, my heart pounding. In the dim light, I saw the mirror from the office lying shattered on the floor. A dark, slimy substance oozed from the broken shards, and a chilling thought struck me. The mirror had been watching me, recording every moment of my terror. A voice, soft and eerie, whispered from behind me, "You shouldn't have come here." I spun around, but there was no one. The whispers continued, growing louder, circling me like a tormenting chant. "You found what you weren't supposed to." Panic surged through me. I sprinted towards the exit, but the doors were locked. I hammered on them, my breaths coming in ragged gasps. My attempts to force them open were futile. The shadows seemed to dance and shift, forming grotesque shapes that mocked my desperate efforts. My flashlight flickered one last time before dying, plunging me into near darkness. As I slumped to the floor, exhausted and defeated, the whispers grew louder, almost deafening. I could make out distorted faces and ghostly figures emerging from the darkness, their eyes glowing with a sinister light. They seemed to be laughing, their voices melding into a cacophony of dread. One figure stepped closer, its features obscured by shadows, but its presence was undeniably malevolent. I realized then that the hotel wasn't just a place haunted by spirits. It was a trap. The entities I had encountered were not merely lost souls. They were predators, feeding on fear and despair. My own curiosity had sealed my fate. The journal had been a final cruel joke, revealing the hotel's dark truth too late. As the darkness closed in, I understood that the hotel's secrets would remain buried with me. My final thoughts were a jumble of fear and regret as the cold enveloped me. The last thing I remember was the oppressive silence, broken only by the whispers of the damned. The hotel had claimed another victim, and as my vision blurred, I knew that my story would be added to its grim collection, a warning to those who dared to uncover its hidden horrors. My name is Jessica Lee. I'm a marine biologist, and I recently took a temporary job as the keeper of an isolated lighthouse at Point Reyes. It was supposed to be a quiet break from the usual hustle of my research work. The rugged coastline and tumultuous waves of the Pacific offered a stark contrast to the controlled environment of my laboratory. The first sight of the lighthouse was both awe-inspiring and unnerving. Perched precariously on the edge of a steep cliff, the structure loomed over the crashing waves below. The wind howled as if whispering secrets through the gaps in the weathered stone walls. Inside, the air was thick with dust, and the creaking floorboards seemed to groan underfoot. I set my bags down in the small, sparse living quarters and looked out the window at the roiling sea. It was beautiful, in a wild, untamed way, but it also felt oddly oppressive. The solitude was overwhelming at first. During the day, I busied myself with the routine tasks of maintaining the lighthouse and monitoring the surrounding waters. The sound of the waves crashing against the rocks below was a constant backdrop, a relentless reminder of my isolation. At night, the lighthouse became a different world. The silence was so deep that it seemed to swallow any sounds I made. I would lie in bed, straining to hear anything beyond the rhythmic crash of the ocean, but the silence was unbroken. One evening, as a storm approached, I noticed something strange. The shadows on the lighthouse walls seemed to shift unnaturally, even though I was alone in the building. The wind battered the windows, and the rain beat down in a relentless assault, yet the shadows appeared to dance in a pattern that didn't quite match the storm's fury. I tried to convince myself it was just the storm playing tricks on my eyes, but a creeping unease settled in. I had set up my camera to document the marine life around the lighthouse. I hoped to capture some unique footage, but the footage was unsettling. There were strange, indistinct shapes darting through the water, and occasionally, shadowy forms would flicker across the screen. I reviewed the footage repeatedly, but each time I found it difficult to explain what I was seeing. It felt like I was being watched, but every time I turned around, there was nothing there. By the end of the first week, the solitude was starting to gnaw at me. The lighthouse felt more like a prison with each passing day. I found myself hearing faint whispers, though I couldn't identify where they were coming from. Every creak of the old building seemed amplified. Every gust of wind felt charged with malevolence. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was lurking just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to make its presence known. The storm had passed, leaving behind a churning sea and an oppressive mist that clung to everything like a damp shroud. The lighthouse, now damp and dreary, seemed to pulse with an unsettling energy. The shadows on the walls were darker, more defined, almost as if they had a life of their own. That night, as I reviewed the footage from my camera, I noticed something odd. In one of the frames, a shadow moved across the water, not in a way that matched the storm's turbulence, but with a deliberate, almost purposeful motion. My heart raced as I rewound the footage, watching it frame by frame. The shadow flickered and twisted, and I could have sworn I saw something resembling a face among the dark shapes. It's just the storm, I told myself. It has to be. I attempted to brush off my growing anxiety by focusing on my work. The lighthouse needed maintenance, and the more I could keep myself occupied, the less I'd think about the creeping dread. Yet, as I climbed the narrow spiral staircase to the lamp room, I felt an icy chill. The air grew colder with each step, and a feeling of being watched intensified. I tried to rationalize it. "It's just my imagination," I whispered to myself, but the words sounded hollow even to me. Later, as I was cleaning the glass of the lantern, I heard a noise behind me. It was faint but unmistakable, a soft, dragging sound that echoed through the empty halls. I turned, heart pounding, but the corridor was empty. I shook my head, trying to dismiss it as the building settling. "Nothing here but me," I muttered, forcing myself to believe it. The next day, while exploring the basement, I stumbled upon an old chest hidden behind a stack of rotting wooden crates. Dust-covered and forgotten, the chest creaked open to reveal a collection of old journals. I skimmed through them, and the entries made my blood run cold. They described encounters with strange sea creatures and spectral figures that roamed the lighthouse at night. One entry in particular detailed a sighting of a dark, formless entity that watched the writer as they slept. The descriptions mirrored my own experiences. I felt a wave of nausea. The idea that others had faced similar horrors made my isolation feel even more profound. That night, sleep eluded me. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing. The whispers I had dismissed before seemed to become louder, more insistent. I was no longer sure if the sounds I heard were real or a figment of my imagination. "Get a grip," I told myself, but the tremor in my voice betrayed me. The wind howled outside, making the windows rattle. Shadows danced on the walls, and I swore I saw something moving just beyond the corner of my vision. Every night since finding the journals, I felt like I was being watched. My sleep became fitful, interrupted by strange dreams of murky water and ghostly figures reaching out from the depths. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, convinced that something was lurking in the shadows just beyond my sight. One evening, after a particularly grueling day, I decided to check the lantern room again. As I climbed the stairs, the familiar chill returned, stronger this time, wrapping around me like icy fingers. My breath fogged in front of me, an oddity in the unseasonably warm air. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see something, or someone, following me. The empty hallway remained silent, but my heart drummed a frantic rhythm. In the lantern room, the wind outside howled louder, making the walls vibrate. I fumbled with the lamp's mechanism, trying to focus on the task at hand. The dim light cast long, wavering shadows that seemed to stretch and contort, almost as if they had a mind of their own. I tried to steady my nerves, telling myself it was just the light playing tricks. But then I heard it, a soft, dragging noise coming from the floor below. It was the same sound I'd heard before, but louder, more insistent. I clambered down the stairs, my footsteps echoing through the empty halls. "It's nothing," I whispered, trying to convince myself. "Just old pipes or the wind." But my voice sounded weak, betraying the anxiety that gripped me. I reached the bottom and peered into the darkness, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. Yet the air felt heavier, colder, as if it were pressing down on me. The following day, I decided to investigate further. I took the journals with me to the local library, hoping to find more information about the lighthouse's past. I spent hours combing through old records and news clippings. The more I read, the more I realized how deeply the lighthouse was entwined with mysterious disappearances and tragic events. It seemed that every few years, someone would vanish without a trace, and the stories always included sightings of strange creatures and ghostly apparitions. Returning to the lighthouse, the weight of what I had learned settled heavily on my shoulders. The lighthouse no longer felt like a sanctuary, but a place of dark secrets. That night, as I lay in bed, the temperature dropped abruptly. I could hear faint whispers again, though this time they were accompanied by a low, rumbling sound, like the distant roar of the ocean. I wanted to get up and check, but a paralyzing fear kept me rooted to the bed. The whispers grew louder, almost as if they were urging me to follow them. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to drown out the sounds, but they only seemed to intensify. In my mind, I replayed the stories from the journals, each account more disturbing than the last. The idea that something supernatural was haunting me became impossible to ignore. The isolation was driving me to the edge. I had come to the lighthouse for solitude and discovery, but now it felt like a prison, each creak and groan of the old building a reminder of the horrors that lay within. The storm that rolled in that night was unlike any I'd seen. The wind howled with a ferocity that made the lighthouse tremble, and the rain pelted against the windows like tiny hammers. I found myself huddled in the small living area, wrapped in a thick blanket, trying to steady my nerves. The unsettling noises I'd been hearing were now joined by the relentless pounding of the storm outside. As the hours passed, I tried to distract myself by reading more of the old journals. The stories within grew increasingly disturbing, describing not only ghostly figures, but also a strange, unnatural presence in the waters surrounding the lighthouse. One account mentioned a peculiar cold spot near the base of the lighthouse, where shadows seemed to take on a life of their own. Unable to shake the feeling of being watched, I decided to investigate the cold spot described in the journal. I grabbed a flashlight and made my way to the lower levels of the lighthouse. The storm's fury intensified, and the wind howled through the cracks in the walls, creating an eerie symphony of noise. My footsteps echoed loudly in the narrow corridors, each sound magnified by the storm's roar. I reached the area described in the journal and felt an immediate drop in temperature. My breath formed visible puffs in the air. I shone the flashlight around, trying to find anything unusual. The beam caught on the peeling wallpaper and the old, dusty furniture, but nothing seemed out of place. Yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was just out of sight, watching me. As I turned to leave, I heard a faint, mournful cry from somewhere above. It was a voice, distant and echoing, like someone was calling for help. My heart raced as I hurried back up the stairs, my mind racing with the implications. What was that cry? Was it a figment of my imagination, or was someone or something trapped in the lighthouse with me? I reached the top and scanned the lantern room, but everything appeared normal. I checked the surrounding area, my flashlight casting erratic shadows. The feeling of dread grew stronger. I knew that I had to find out more about what was happening. The storm raged on outside, amplifying my sense of isolation. I returned to the journals, desperate for any clue that might explain the eerie happenings. The words on the pages seemed to blur together as I read, my fatigue and fear merging into a fog of anxiety. I saw mention of an ancient mariner's curse tied to the lighthouse and its keepers. As the night wore on, I couldn't escape the feeling that I was part of something much larger and far more sinister than I had anticipated. The lighthouse was not just a remote outpost, but a gateway to something dark and ancient. The storm raged on, an unending roar that seemed to echo my growing panic. I couldn't shake the feeling that the lighthouse was alive, its walls pulsing with a dark energy. As I sat in the small room, clutching the old journals, a creeping sensation of dread settled over me. The air grew thick and oppressive, and every creak of the building felt like a whisper of something malevolent. I glanced at the clock. It was nearly midnight. The storm's fury had intensified, and the wind howled louder than ever. The journals had described the lighthouse as a beacon for something far more sinister, creatures of the deep and restless spirits. As I read, my eyes kept returning to a passage that detailed a final, horrifying encounter. A shadowy figure emerging from the depths during a storm, seeking something or someone. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from below. I jumped, my heart racing. The storm outside seemed to pale in comparison to the chaos inside the lighthouse. I grabbed a flashlight and headed downstairs, every step feeling like it took a lifetime. The beams of my flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but empty, dust-laden rooms. When I reached the bottom, I noticed something unusual. The large, old door leading to the cellar was ajar. I hadn't opened it. I approached cautiously, the air growing colder with each step. As I pushed the door open, a faint, otherworldly glow emanated from the stairs leading down. My breath caught in my throat. I descended into the cellar, where the glow grew stronger. The walls were lined with strange symbols I hadn't noticed before. In the center of the room, illuminated by an eerie light, was an old chest. The journals had mentioned such a chest, supposedly holding the key to the lighthouse's dark past. My hands trembled as I opened it. Inside, I found a collection of old, brittle photographs and more journals. Among them was a photo of a previous lighthouse keeper, standing next to an object that looked unsettlingly familiar, a large, ancient conch shell. I recognized it immediately. It was the same one I had seen in the lighthouse's window earlier. It wasn't just an old relic, it was a focal point of the curse. The final journal entry was the most chilling. It described the lighthouse as a beacon for vengeful spirits and ancient sea creatures, all seeking something lost to them. As I read the last lines, a cold draft swept through the room, and the temperature plummeted. Shadows danced on the walls, and a low, mournful wail filled the air. In that moment, I understood the true horror of the lighthouse. It wasn't merely haunted, it was a gateway to a realm of darkness. The storm outside was a mere backdrop to the real storm brewing within the lighthouse. I felt a chilling presence behind me and turned slowly, knowing that whatever was in the lighthouse had been waiting for me all along. I'm Michael Harris, a historian who's always been fascinated by local legends and ghost stories. When I heard about the abandoned farm in Iowa City, I knew I had to check it out. It's a place with a reputation for being eerie, filled with nothing but overgrown cornfields and crumbling barns. The farm's isolation adds to its mystique, and it's that isolation that drew me in. Arriving at the farm, I felt a chill as the wind rustled through the tall corn stalks. The old farmhouse, covered in ivy, loomed like a forgotten sentinel from a bygone era. I set up my camera and voice recorder, hoping to capture something that would justify the trip. The silence was overwhelming, punctuated only by the occasional creak of the old wooden structures. As I wandered through the barn, the decay was palpable. The floorboards groaned under my weight, and dust danced in the narrow beams of sunlight filtering through broken windows. The air was heavy with the scent of mildew and rot. My flashlight cast strange shadows on the walls, and I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching me. I tried to shake off the uneasy sensation. "It's just my imagination," I told myself. But then I heard it. A faint, high-pitched laughter drifting through the cornfield. I turned, but there was nothing. Only the endless rows of corn swaying gently in the breeze. I thought it was odd. Why would children's laughter be here, in a place so clearly abandoned? I moved closer to the cornfield, my footsteps muffled by the overgrown grass. The swings in the small play area near the farmhouse began to move slightly, though there wasn't a hint of wind. I stood there, trying to rationalize it, but my heart raced. "Probably just the wind," I muttered, though the air was still. The more I explored, the more the atmosphere thickened. The feeling of being watched grew stronger, and I found myself glancing over my shoulder more often. I decided to call it a day and review my recordings, but as I packed up, the whispers seemed to grow louder, more insistent. I had to know more about this place. Whatever was here, it was more than just an old, abandoned farm. The next day, I dove into the local archives to uncover more about the farm's history. My research revealed a series of unsettling events tied to this place. It wasn't just an old farm. It had a dark past filled with failed harvests and inexplicable disappearances. Some of the reports mentioned strange occurrences around the farm, but nothing concrete. I was particularly struck by a journal entry from a former owner. The writing was erratic, the words almost frantic. It described how the farm seemed to take on a life of its own during the night. "The fields whisper," the entry said, "and the children's laughter echoes even though they're long gone." I felt a shiver as I read it. The more I learned, the more the laughter I'd heard took on a sinister edge. Deciding to return to the farm, I felt a mix of excitement and dread. The sun was setting, and the shadows cast by the fading light turned the fields into a maze of darkness. I tried to focus on my work, but the unease from the previous day had grown. Every sound seemed amplified: the creaking of the barn, the rustle of leaves in the wind. Even the gentle sway of the swing set seemed unnerving. As I walked through the fields, the corn stalks seemed to close in on me. My flashlight barely cut through the dense darkness, and I felt like I was walking in a tunnel of green. The whispers returned, more distinct this time, though I couldn't make out any words. It was as if the wind carried them from a place just beyond reach. I stopped and listened. The swings creaked in rhythm, though the air was still. The sight of them moving slowly was disconcerting. I had to remind myself that there were likely rational explanations. But then, I noticed something odd. One of the swings, previously stationary, began to move more vigorously, as if someone was pushing it. I stared at it, heart pounding, trying to rationalize it. That's when I saw it, a figure darting between the rows of corn. It was gone before I could fully process what I'd seen. My mind raced with possibilities, but the fear was undeniable. I could feel my pulse quickening. I had to find out what was really happening here. There was something profoundly disturbing about the idea of forces beyond comprehension manipulating this place. I decided to stay at the farm overnight, hoping to experience whatever was causing the disturbances firsthand. The sun set quickly, and I set up my equipment in the barn, trying to ignore the growing sense of dread that settled over me like a heavy fog. The old barn was a maze of broken beams and dusty old tools, each creak and groan of the wood echoing through the night. As the darkness enveloped the fields, I tried to focus on my research notes, but my mind kept drifting. The whispers from earlier still echoed in my ears. "It's just the wind," I told myself. "It's just the wind." Yet the more I repeated it, the less I believed it. Every shadow seemed to take on a life of its own. The quiet outside was oppressive, broken only by the occasional gust of wind that rattled the barn doors. Around midnight, I heard it again, a faint giggling. It was distant but unmistakable. My flashlight flickered, and I felt a chill run down my spine. The laughter was different this time, more playful but with a tinge of malice. I grabbed my flashlight and ventured outside, the beam cutting through the thick darkness of the cornfield. The air was cold, and my breath formed small clouds that quickly dissipated. I walked cautiously through the cornfield, the tall stalks brushing against me. My flashlight caught glimpses of movement between the rows, dark shapes darting just out of view. My heart raced. I stopped and listened. The laughter was louder now, almost as if it was right behind me. I spun around, but there was nothing there, only the rustling of corn and the oppressive darkness. Suddenly, the ground beneath me shifted, and I stumbled, nearly falling. I caught myself and noticed a small, overgrown path leading deeper into the field. Curiosity and fear battled inside me. I had to know what was causing the disturbances. I followed the path, the laughter growing louder and more frenzied. The path led to an old, decrepit swing set at the edge of the field. The swings were moving rhythmically, though the air was still. I approached cautiously, feeling as though I was walking into a trap. As I reached out to touch one of the swings, it stopped moving abruptly. My flashlight illuminated the swing set, and I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Carved into the wooden posts were strange symbols, faded but unmistakably ominous. I took a step back, my mind racing with the implications. There was something deeply unsettling about this place. I could feel it watching me, waiting. The shadows seemed to grow longer, and the air felt thicker. I was frozen in place, staring at the swing set, trying to make sense of the symbols carved into the wood. The swings remained still, but the eerie feeling of being watched didn't waver. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my racing heart, and decided to head back to the barn to review my notes. I needed to think clearly, but something kept tugging at my mind. The journey back to the barn was more nerve-wracking than I'd anticipated. The cornfield, once a place of curiosity, now felt like a maze closing in on me. Every rustle in the dark seemed amplified, every shadow a potential threat. My flashlight flickered again, making the surroundings appear even more distorted. I swore under my breath and shook the flashlight, willing it to stay steady. When I finally reached the barn, I felt a small sense of relief. Inside, I tried to focus on the old diaries I'd found earlier. They were filled with disjointed notes and sketches that hinted at something sinister. Words like harvest, sacrifice, and restless spirits jumped out at me, sending chills down my spine. It was as if the writers had anticipated someone like me stumbling into their trap. I couldn't shake the feeling that the diaries were a warning. Maybe they were just superstitious, I told myself. People in the past had their own ways of explaining things. But as I read on, I found descriptions of eerie phenomena that matched my own experiences. One entry mentioned a peculiar feeling of being watched and a sudden drop in temperature, both of which I had felt. Suddenly, a loud bang from outside jolted me upright. I grabbed my flashlight and darted out of the barn, the cold air hitting me like a wall. I scanned the area but saw nothing unusual. "Get a grip, Michael," I muttered, though my voice trembled. "It's just the wind or maybe an animal." Yet, deep down, I knew this wasn't just a matter of nature. As I turned to head back inside, I noticed the swing set again. This time, the swings were moving slightly, as if someone had just been on them. The sight made my skin crawl. I approached cautiously, my flashlight beam revealing something new: small, muddy footprints leading away from the swing set and towards a hidden part of the barn. I followed them, each step increasing my unease. The footprints led me to an old shed, half buried in the undergrowth. The door creaked open, revealing a dark interior. I hesitated before stepping inside. The shed smelled of decay and something else, something that made my stomach churn. The beam of my flashlight revealed more symbols and a strange altar in the corner. It was then I understood the true depth of the farm's dark history. Something was very wrong, and I was getting too close to the heart of it. I stood frozen in the doorway of the shed, my flashlight illuminating the disturbing scene before me. The symbols etched into the walls and the altar in the corner were unlike anything I had ever seen. I could feel my pulse quicken as the realization dawned on me. This was no ordinary farm. The whispers of old legends, the eerie sensations, everything was starting to make a sinister kind of sense. The altar was covered in dust and strange, dried substances that I didn't want to identify. In the dim light, I noticed an old, tattered book lying open on the altar. Its pages were filled with more cryptic symbols and phrases that seemed to vibrate with a dark energy. I could barely make out a passage that repeated the word harvest over and over, each mention feeling like a cold threat. I scanned the room, feeling the oppressive weight of an unseen presence pressing down on me. My thoughts raced. What did these people believe in? What were they doing? I whispered to myself, but my voice seemed swallowed by the darkness. The book was clearly central to whatever was going on here, and I had to know more. Suddenly, a creak came from behind me. My heart leapt into my throat. I spun around, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The swing set outside was now moving vigorously, as if it were being rocked by an unseen force. I backed away from the altar, trying to stay calm, but my hands were trembling. I heard a soft, eerie sound, like children's laughter, but twisted and distorted. It was coming from the direction of the cornfield. My mind raced, piecing together fragments of the history I'd read. Children's laughter? I thought. But there are no children around. I felt a cold sweat forming on my brow. The laughter grew louder, more menacing, blending with a low, rhythmic thumping that seemed to come from the very ground. I had to leave. As I turned to flee, my flashlight flickered wildly before going out altogether. The sudden darkness was suffocating. I fumbled to relight it, but the beam only showed me fleeting shadows that danced in the peripheral of my vision. Every sound was amplified: my breathing, my footsteps, the ever-increasing thump from the ground. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the thumping ceased. The laughter stopped. I found my way back to the barn, panting heavily. The darkness seemed to swallow the familiar space. I knew then that whatever haunted this place wasn't just part of the past. It was very much alive. I had stumbled into something that was far beyond my understanding. I realized that the farm's history was not just about failed crops and mysterious disappearances. It was a living nightmare that had been waiting for someone like me to come and uncover its secrets. I had to leave, but the thought of what was lurking in the shadows kept me paralyzed. The feeling of being watched was more intense than ever. As I prepared to escape, I looked back one last time at the farm, knowing that its darkness would follow me long after I was gone. The fear I felt was not just for my own safety, but for the very essence of what I had uncovered. The farm was a living, breathing entity, hungry for more. I stood at the edge of Hoya Baciu Forest, feeling the weight of the Romanian air pressing down on me. The forest loomed ahead, its twisted trees and dense underbrush almost mocking my professional curiosity. The locals called it the Bermuda Triangle of Transylvania, and as an anthropologist with a penchant for unraveling the unknown, I had to see it for myself. The stories of vanishing hikers and eerie lights had intrigued me for years. Now, I was finally here. "Is this it?" my colleague Mark asked, adjusting his camera. His voice betrayed his nerves despite his attempt to sound nonchalant. "Feels like we're stepping into a bad dream." "Looks like it," I replied, trying to match his casual tone, though my heart pounded louder with each step into the woods. The air grew colder as we moved forward, the forest swallowing the last remnants of sunlight. We set up our equipment, cameras, recorders, and environmental sensors, hoping to capture whatever the forest was hiding. The anticipation was thick, almost tangible. As we worked, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The forest had an unsettling quiet to it, as though it was holding its breath. The wind rustled the leaves, but it seemed almost too deliberate, too rhythmic. I glanced over at Mark, who was busy setting up the last camera. He looked up and met my eyes, his expression tense. "Everything okay?" I asked, trying to break the growing unease. "Yeah, just a bit creeped out," he admitted, his voice low. "It's like something's waiting for us to make a mistake." His words echoed my own fears. The forest's reputation for distorting time and reality weighed heavily on me. I was aware of the stories of inexplicable phenomena here, flashes of light that defied explanation and time seeming to slip away. As night began to fall, the forest's shadows lengthened, making the trees appear as if they were reaching out to us. When we finished setting up, I took a moment to review the footage we'd already recorded. The grainy images on the screen were mundane, but the forest's oppressive atmosphere made every flicker and shadow seem significant. The sense of something just out of sight, something lurking, was growing stronger. "We should head back soon," Mark suggested, his voice trembling slightly. I nodded, though a part of me wanted to stay, to see if something truly extraordinary would happen. As we made our way back to our base, I glanced over my shoulder. The forest seemed to watch us with an almost sentient gaze, its dark expanse holding secrets that I could only begin to comprehend. The first night in the village was unsettling. Every creak of the old wooden floorboards and every distant, indistinct sound seemed amplified. As I lay in bed trying to sleep, my mind raced with thoughts of what might lie within those shadowy trees. The forest had always been a place of mystery and fear, and I couldn't help but wonder if I was about to uncover something that should remain hidden. The next day, we would delve deeper into Hoya Baciu, and I had to brace myself for whatever the forest had in store. The chilling whispers of the wind and the dark, oppressive silence were only the beginning. The next morning arrived with a cold, gray light filtering through the small window of our rented cottage. I rubbed my eyes, the remnants of a restless night still clinging to me. We prepared for another day in the forest, the weight of what we had heard and felt pressing on us. Despite the sun's weak warmth, the forest's shadow seemed to cling to our backs. We set out early, the forest greeting us with its usual silence. The cameras were rolling, and our equipment recorded every crack of a twig and rustle of leaves. I tried to focus on the data collection, but my mind kept drifting back to the previous day's strange occurrences. The feeling of being watched was persistent, like invisible eyes were following our every move. "Do you ever feel like we're being watched?" Mark's voice broke the silence as he adjusted one of the cameras. "All the time," I replied, more sharply than I intended, "but it's probably just nerves." Still, I couldn't ignore the eerie atmosphere that seemed to wrap around us. As we ventured deeper, the trees seemed to grow denser, their twisted branches forming grotesque shapes against the sky. Every so often, I would catch a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye, but when I turned, there was nothing there. We reached a clearing that was unlike anything I had seen before. The ground was oddly smooth, almost as if it had been flattened intentionally. Old, decaying stones were scattered around, forming what looked like the remnants of an ancient structure. My curiosity piqued, and I began examining the area more closely. "Rachel, come here," Mark called out. His voice was tinged with urgency. I hurried over to where he stood, pointing at a series of strange markings etched into a large rock. The symbols were unfamiliar and unnerving. "What do you make of this?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I ran my fingers over the symbols, feeling a cold shiver. I don't know, but these don't look like anything I've seen before. They might be related to the stories of the forest's dark past. As we continued exploring, the atmosphere grew more oppressive. The air felt thicker, almost suffocating. Our equipment started picking up strange anomalies, voices that seemed to come from nowhere, and sudden, inexplicable fluctuations in temperature. The sensors beeped intermittently, signaling disturbances that made my skin crawl. By late afternoon, we decided to review some of the footage from the day. In the dim light of our base, the grainy images on the screen seemed to dance with shadows. I could barely make out the shapes of figures moving between the trees, their forms shifting and flickering. The laughter we had heard earlier echoed through the recordings, though we hadn't heard it with our own ears. "What the hell is this?" Mark's voice was shaky as he watched the screen. "Is this real?" I couldn't answer. I was too busy replaying the footage, my heart racing. The laughter, the shapes in the trees, it all pointed to something far more sinister than I had anticipated. I felt a growing unease, a sense that we were scratching the surface of something deeply troubling. The sun dipped below the horizon, and the forest seemed to come alive with an unsettling energy. As night settled in, I tried to focus on the task at hand, but my mind kept drifting to the strange occurrences and eerie sounds. What was waiting for us in the darkness of Hoya Baciu? What were we truly uncovering? Every creak of the old cottage and every distant rustle of the forest seemed amplified. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being drawn deeper into the forest's web, and whatever awaited us might be far more terrifying than we were prepared to face. The mystery of Hoya Baciu was only beginning to unravel, and I could only hope that we were ready for what lay ahead. The forest felt different the next day. It was as if the trees had closed in tighter, their twisted branches casting more threatening shadows. I tried to ignore the chill that ran down my spine, focusing instead on the data collection. But every snap of a twig underfoot, every rustle of leaves, seemed magnified in the oppressive silence. We split up to cover more ground, a decision I was already beginning to regret. My team, seasoned professionals in their own right, were equally on edge. Mark and I decided to investigate a particularly dense part of the woods. As we walked, I couldn't shake the feeling of being followed. The shadows seemed to move with us, always a step behind. "Rachel, you see that?" Mark said, his voice barely audible over the crunching leaves. He pointed toward a dark patch between the trees. I squinted and saw nothing but the inky blackness of the forest. "See what?" I asked, though I felt a growing unease. I glanced back at the clearing we had just left, but it looked unchanged, as if mocking our paranoia. We continued into the dark area, the atmosphere thickening with each step. The air was unnervingly still, the usual forest sounds muted as if being swallowed by an unseen force. I kept checking the equipment, hoping for something concrete to distract me from the growing dread. The cameras picked up nothing unusual, but the temperature gauge was fluctuating wildly. As we pressed on, a faint giggling reached our ears, barely audible but unmistakable. It was high-pitched and oddly cheerful, a stark contrast to the oppressive gloom surrounding us. My heart pounded as I turned to Mark. "Did you hear that?" He nodded, his face pale. "Yeah, but I don't see anyone. Maybe it's just a trick of the wind?" "I don't know," I said, my voice trembling despite my efforts to remain calm. "It doesn't feel like just wind." We stopped to review the footage from our cameras. The recordings showed something that made my blood run cold. Shadows moved in and out of the frame, seemingly of their own accord, and there, in the corner of one clip, was a fleeting glimpse of what looked like a child's face peering from behind a tree. "I'm not sure what we're dealing with here," Mark said, running a hand through his hair. "But it's getting worse." As night began to fall, the forest transformed into a labyrinth of darkness. The trees seemed to sway and shift, their forms becoming distorted and menacing. Every now and then, a gust of wind would bring with it an unsettling whisper, just out of reach. The forest seemed alive, reacting to our presence in ways that defied logic. Our radios crackled to life with static, and we could barely make out distorted voices. The equipment was acting up too, readings bouncing between extremes, creating a sense of disorientation. It felt as though time itself was playing tricks on us. What should have been hours felt like minutes, and vice versa. "I can't take this anymore," Mark finally said, his voice filled with frustration and fear. "We need to get out of here." I agreed, but the path back seemed more convoluted and unfamiliar than before. It was as if the forest was intentionally leading us astray. I glanced at the dense darkness around us, the shadows seeming to pulse and breathe. Every step was a battle against the rising panic. The forest's whispers grew louder, the distorted laughter more frequent. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched by unseen eyes, and the growing sense of dread was almost palpable. As we finally stumbled back to the base, exhausted and shaken, I tried to rationalize what we had experienced. But the sense of unease persisted. What were we really dealing with in Hoya Baciu? The forest was holding its secrets close, and every step deeper into its heart seemed to unravel more than we were prepared to understand. We returned to camp feeling utterly defeated. Exhausted, I slumped into my chair and stared at the flickering screen of our monitoring equipment. The forest had been relentless, its grip tightening with each passing moment. My mind raced with questions and theories, but nothing seemed to fit. "Rachel, do you think it's worth trying again tomorrow?" Mark asked, his voice weary. "I don't know," I said, rubbing my temples. "We need answers, but the forest doesn't seem to want to give them up easily. It's almost as if it's alive." The others were huddled around, their faces mirroring the same anxiety I felt. The tension in the air was palpable, a heavy cloud that seemed to press down on us. I took a deep breath and tried to focus on the footage we had captured. Maybe there was something we missed, a clue buried in the chaos. As I reviewed the footage, I noticed something unsettling. In one clip, a fleeting shadow crossed the screen, followed by a burst of static. I zoomed in and froze. The shadow wasn't just a trick of the light, it was the unmistakable shape of a child, but with eyes that gleamed in a way that was far from innocent. "Mark, look at this," I said, my voice trembling. "Do you see what I see?" He came over, squinting at the screen. "Is that a child? What is it doing there?" "I don't know," I replied, "but it doesn't look like any normal child. It's almost like it's watching us." The unease settled over us like a shroud. The more we tried to analyze the footage, the more we were drawn into the forest's sinister web. The constant feeling of being watched grew stronger. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig seemed to be magnified, each sound a reminder that we were not alone. That night, sleep came reluctantly. Every time I closed my eyes, I was haunted by the child's glowing eyes and the whispering laughter that seemed to follow me into my dreams. I woke up drenched in sweat, heart racing, convinced that the forest had somehow seeped into my very soul. The next day, we decided to venture deeper into Hoya Baciu, hoping to confront whatever it was that lay hidden in its depths. As we walked, the air grew colder, and the forest seemed to close in around us. The trees appeared to twist and contort, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. "I have a bad feeling about this," Mark said, his voice barely above a whisper. "So do I admitted. "But we need to see this through. There's something here, and we need to uncover it." As we ventured further, the sense of dread became almost unbearable. The forest seemed to distort around us. We'd find ourselves walking in circles, the same landmarks appearing over and over again. It was as if the forest was mocking our attempts to escape. Suddenly, the cameras picked up something that made my heart skip a beat. A series of rapid flashes, followed by a distorted, almost garbled sound. I rewound the footage and saw something that defied explanation. Figures, shadows really, darting in and out of view, their movements erratic and unnerving. "This isn't right," I said, my voice quivering. "We need to get out of here. Now." But as we tried to leave, the path seemed to twist and turn, leading us deeper into the heart of the forest. The trees closed in tighter, the shadows lengthening. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. It felt as though the forest itself was alive, closing in on us, its dark presence growing more oppressive with each step. As we finally stumbled back to the base, our equipment malfunctioning and our nerves frayed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting for us. The forest's secrets were far from being revealed, and I wondered if we had inadvertently awakened something that was better left undisturbed. The sense of impending doom lingered, an unsettling reminder that Hoyabachi was a place where the boundaries between reality and nightmare were perilously thin. We barely made it back to camp, our spirits as frayed as our nerves. The forest had turned against us, and the sense of dread was now a constant companion. We needed answers, but the more we delved into Hoyabachi, the more it seemed to fight back, toying with our sanity. That evening, as we huddled around the fire, trying to shake off the oppressive gloom, I couldn't shake the image of the shadowy figures from the footage. I replayed the scenes in my mind, the eerie figures darting in and out of view. I kept wondering if there was a pattern or if we had missed something crucial. Mark's voice broke through my thoughts. "Rachel, are you okay? You've been quiet." "I'm fine," I said, though the lie tasted bitter. "Just trying to make sense of everything." Then it happened. A burst of static from one of our recording devices drew our attention. I grabbed it and replayed the last few minutes of audio. The sound was distorted but unmistakable, a voice, clear as day, whispering in an unfamiliar language. I had no idea what it was saying, but the tone was unmistakably malicious. "Listen to this," I said, holding out the recorder. The group fell silent as they listened. The air grew colder, and the once warm fire seemed to flicker weakly, as if afraid. We exchanged uneasy glances. It was clear that something was deeply wrong. "Rachel, what do you think it means?" Mark asked, his voice trembling. "I don't know," I admitted, "but it feels like a warning, like we're being taunted." As night fell, the atmosphere grew heavier. The forest outside seemed to pulse with a sinister energy. I lay awake in my tent, unable to escape the unsettling feeling that something was watching us. The forest's oppressive silence was occasionally shattered by distant, dissonant sounds, perhaps the laughter of unseen entities. At some point, I drifted off into an uneasy sleep, only to wake up to a jarring noise. It was a strange, rhythmic tapping against the tent walls. I glanced at the clock, 3:03 a.m. My heart pounded. I cautiously unzipped the tent and stepped outside, my flashlight slicing through the darkness. What I saw froze me in place. The trees around our camp had shifted, their branches now forming what looked like a crude, unsettling pattern. In the center of this pattern, there was a pile of soil, freshly turned, as if something had been recently buried. The soil was smeared with strange symbols, and a disturbing chill ran down my spine. "Rachel!" Mark's voice was a frantic whisper from behind me. I turned, and my flashlight illuminated his pale face. "What is it?" I asked. "Look at the footage," he said urgently. "We missed something." We rushed back to the camp, and I reviewed the footage once more. There in the background of one of the clips was a fleeting image, clearer now than before. It showed a figure emerging from the pile of soil, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light. "What is this?" I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. Mark's face paled further. I think we've disturbed something that was meant to stay buried." The realization hit me with a wave of dread. The forest had been more than just a backdrop for our investigation. It was an entity in itself, one that had been waiting for us to uncover its dark secrets. We had become part of a much larger, more terrifying narrative. With the dawn approaching, we packed up as quickly as we could. The forest seemed to watch us with malevolent intent as we left, its darkness pressing in around us. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed us out of Hoyabachi, a presence that would linger long after we left the forest behind. The truth, it seemed, was not meant to be uncovered. As we drove away, I glanced back at the looming trees, wondering what other secrets Hoyabachi held. The chilling realization was that some mysteries are better left unsolved, for they hold horrors that defy human comprehension. And as I looked out the window, the thought gnawed at me. Had we truly escaped, or had we only just begun to uncover the forest's darkest secret?